Between 1992 to 1999, the horrifying case of one of Australia's most notorious serial killings took the lives of 12 people. Most of the bodies were infamously dumped in barrel bins filled with hydrochloric acid and were uncovered in the sleepy rural South Australian town of Snowtown. And now, after 25 years, one member of the murderous cohort has just been released on parole, with another to potentially be released in 2025. Located on the lands of the Wagner Nation in eastern South Australia and lying within the Wakefield Council area, Snowtown has a population of merely 467, likely one of the reasons why its abandoned bank was chosen to hide the victims' bodies. Lying on the crossroads between Adelaide and Perth, the area has a perfect warm Mediterranean-type climate where summers are not too hot and winters are not too cold. The region's economy is largely driven by cereal crops, livestock production, wool and salt mining. The area around Snowtown has attractions to enjoy, such as Lake Bumbunga, a salt lake coloured pink by strange algae, the Owen Silo art, and the quaint Port Wakefield Wharf. Previously, for many people, maybe even you and I, stopping by this small town with less than 500 people could have been a relaxing escape from their busy lives, especially if you live in a dense cityscape. However, that is not the case anymore. If you visit Snowtown now, you will instead find a town that is desperately trying to erase its dark and horrifying past. Although only one of the murders actually occurred in Snowtown itself, and rather it had been used as a dumping ground for bodies to decompose, the town's name has forever been linked to the heinous murders. From 1992 to 1999, a group composed of John Bunting, Robert Wagner and James Vlassakis, who was only 19 years old at the time, along with their accomplice Mark Haydon, ruthlessly hunted the unsuspecting citizens of their regional town. The group chose their victims from among their friends, family and even one of their own members, with many of the victims being labelled as sickos or dirty for allegedly being. To Bunting, this included the gay community and drug users, solely based on rumours. John Justin Bunting, born in Inala, Queensland on the 4th of September 1966, is described as the gang's leader, and he killed his victims, people he already knew, by instructing his members to prey upon them. Apart from being fueled by hatred, his motive included monetary gain, as he would steal his victims' welfare payments after murdering them. It was later reported that the group had cumulatively gained a grand total of 95,000 Australian dollars in welfare payments through their victims. However, later in 1997, their motives would become less and less clear, making it obvious that the group seemed to take pleasure in the act of killing itself. This would later send chilling reverberations throughout the continent with the uncovering of their vicious slayings in 1999. Strangely enough, Bunting had what he termed a rock spider wall made out of paper notes interconnected with blue wool in the spare room of his Salisbury North home. This wall was made up of a list of names of people he decided were sickos, and he would then pick a name at random and call that person, only saying cryptically that they would get what's coming to them. Bunting was also seen by one of his co-offenders, James Vlassakis, as a father figure. In fact, Bunting had actually married Vlassakis' mother, Elizabeth Harvey. Knowing of Bunting's unrelenting hatred towards homosexuality, and Vlassakis would confide in Bunting that he had been at the age of just 13 by his half-brother Troy Yude, who was later killed in 1998, further cementing the idea in Bunting's twisted mind that there was no difference between homosexuality and his body was one of the many later found dismembered and stored in one of the barrel bins in the Snowtown bank. It all began when Bunting moved to Waterloo Corner Road at Salisbury North in 1991, where he met Robert Wagner. At that time, Wagner had lived with his then partner, Barry Lane. In August of 1992, the three men successfully murdered their first victim, Clinton Trezise, who was referred to as Happy Pants in conversations between the three men. Trezise, who was 22 years old at the time, was accused of being by the group. Trezise was buried in a shallow grave later found in 1994 in Lower Light, a 40-minute drive north of Adelaide. This murder resulted in the grave being featured on the TV show Australia's Most Wanted in 1997. Bunting would watch this episode with Vlassakis and his mother, boasting to them, That's my handiwork. It was not until 3 years later that he would continue on his killing spree by murdering Ray Davies, an intellectually disabled man who had previously had a relationship with Suzanne Allen, an ex-girlfriend of Bunting's. His body was found buried in Bunting's Salisbury North backyard in December of 1995. Bunting would also continue to collect Davies' welfare payments after his death. Shockingly, Bunting's fourth victim was in fact Barry Lane, who had helped him in his first murder back in 1992. Barry Lane, also known as Vanessa, was a crossdresser convicted in 1986 for two 12-year-old boys and who had dated Robert Wagner from 1985 to 1996 when Wagner was only 13 years old. Bunting labelled, legally the only time he was correct in doing so, Lane, and therefore one of his listed dirty. Later it was known that Bunting had only associated himself with Lane to gain information about in the area. However, it is possible that Lane was giving Bunting false information and was naming only those he simply did not like. Lane's toes were squeezed with a pair of pliers prior to his death, and his dismembered body was found in a barrel bin wrapped in carpet along with Bunting's third victim, Michael Gardiner, who was an openly gay man and who Bunting thought was also a Bunting's fifth victim in October of 1997 was Thomas Trevelyan, who had previously assisted Bunting and Wagner in their murder of Barry Lane, due to Trevelyan being Lane's roommate at the time. Trevelyan was described as someone who would and go mental and was therefore a liability. Trevelyan had had a history of psychiatric problems. For example, if he heard unfamiliar noises outside his house, he would run around outside waving knives around, resulting in his murder initially being ruled as by the police. His body was found hanging from a tree in Adelaide Hills. As mentioned earlier, Vlassakis used to confide in Bunting about his own at the hands of his half-brother, Troy Yude. However, Troy was also Bunting's stepson through his marriage to Elizabeth Harvey, Yude's and Vlassakis' mother. Yude would become their next target and was attacked while he was sleeping in his Murray Bridge home. When he was being handcuffed, Yude was dragged into a bathroom in Bunting's residence. His toes were squeezed with pliers and he was forced to apologize to Vlassakis for his. Finally, Wagner made sure that Yude was dead by standing on his chest. In Bunting's mind, drug users were classified as waste and undeserving of life, such as his next victim, Gavin Porter. Porter was a heroin user and a friend of his stepson Vlassakis, with whom he had also used heroin. Bunting and Wagner murdered Gavin Porter by attacking him as he slept in his car while it was parked in Bunting's driveway. He was strangled to death, but not before Porter managed to stab Bunting's hand with a screwdriver. Bunting would later display his corpse to Vlassakis before disposing of his body. Bunting was also known for hunting the weak, such as the intellectually disabled, likely due to them being easy targets for him. Both of his victims in September and then November of 1998 were disabled men. Bunting had become convinced without any evidence that Fred Brooks, who was the son of Bunting's fiancée, Jodie Elliott, was young girls. Brooks was brutally tortured and murdered. His toes were squeezed with pliers, he was internally burned with cigarettes and sparklers, and was electrically shocked repeatedly amongst other horrifying things before being finally murdered by the trio, Bunting, Wagner and Vlassakis. Brooks's body was then later moved by Mark Haydon, who continued collecting Brooks's welfare payments after his death. The group's next victim, Gary O'Dwyer, who had the misfortune of merely living next door, was also killed by Bunting, Wagner and Vlassakis. Vlassakis was instructed by Bunting to gather information about O'Dwyer and found out that he lived alone, making O'Dwyer another easy target. Adding to this fact, he was also disabled from a car accident and would be unable to provide much of a fight. Bunting killed O'Dwyer purely for his own financial gain, as there was no effort given to create any illusion of justification for his murder. Sadly, even being the wife of one of the members of the group did not equate to being safe from becoming a target. The group's next victim was Elizabeth Haydon, who was killed on November 20th of 1998. Elizabeth was Mark Haydon's wife, Fred Brooks's aunt, and Jodie Elliott's sister. Even though she was murdered when Haydon was out of the house, it was later uncovered that Haydon had helped to conceal his wife's murder. Elizabeth Haydon was the only female victim, and it was because of her being reported missing by her brother that police were led to monitor Mark Haydon and eventually search the abandoned bank in Snowtown. The group's last victim before being apprehended was David Johnson, Johnson, Vlassakis' fastidious and tidy half-brother who was murdered on the 9th of May 1999. Though Johnson was not a gay man, Bunting would often hurl gay slurs at him and decided that he needed to die. Johnson was lured to the abandoned bank by Vlassakis under the pretense of going to buy a used computer. He was strangled with his own belt, handcuffed, and forced to give his bank details to Bunting and Haydon. Wagner and Vlassakis were later instructed to drive to Port Wakefield to access Johnson's bank account, but later came back unsuccessful. However, by this time, Johnson was already dead. Sickeningly, after Bunting and Wagner dismembered Johnson's body, they fried and ate parts of his body, adding to their seemingly unending list of depraved crimes. David Johnson was the only victim to have been killed in Snowtown itself. Although 12 bodies were found, Suzanne Allen, who died after Ray Davies in 1995, with her body being found buried in different plastic bags, Bunting denied killing her, claiming that she had died of a heart attack, and in the end there was not enough evidence to definitively prove her cause of death, and so only 11 counts of murder could be given. Her death was concealed by Bunting so he could keep collecting her pension payments. The police also obtained recordings that were used as court evidence from devices installed in Mark Haydon's house after Elizabeth Haydon's disappearance. The audio then led police to the unused Snowtown bank that was rented under the name of Mark Lawrence, Mark Haydon's former name before his marriage to Elizabeth. As Snowtown is such a small town, any strange or unfamiliar movements would draw the local suspicion. Initially, the bodies of Bunting's victims were stored in various places before being moved to the Snowtown bank, such as in 2 vehicles that were found, a Toyota Land Cruiser and a Mitsubishi Sigma, which were filled with barrels of hydrochloric acid and his victims' corpses. These vehicles were then moved to the unused Snowtown bank by the group, and the strange unloading activities stood out to the locals who were eventually questioned by the police. This suspicious activity caused the abandoned bank to be searched. On the 23rd of May 1999, the shallow grave of Clinton Trezise, the first victim, was uncovered in Lower Lights. This piqued police's interests as it would link to 2 victims not found in the bank, Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen, who were buried in the backyard of Bunting's former house. Soon after, James Vlassakis was also charged with murder. Later, during the trials, Vlassakis gave evidence against Bunting and the other members of the group. After 7 days of deliberation in December of 2003, Bunting would receive 11 life sentences while Wagner would receive 10, and the whole trial cost nearly 15 million Australian dollars. Vlassakis, on the other hand, the youngest of the group, had been found guilty of only 4 of the murders. As mentioned before, during the trials he had cooperated the most and had given evidence against Bunting and the other members. Therefore, for his own protection, the court granted suppression orders to restrict any images of Vlassakis from being published. Vlassakis, who is now 44, may also be eligible for parole next year. Mark Haydon, who is now 65 years old, was initially charged with 2 of the murders, but was never found guilty in any of the others. He was, however, found guilty in covering up 7 of the murders and assisting in the others, as he had stored the bodies at his Smithfield Plains home before moving them to the bank vault in Snowtown. He was sentenced to 25 years of jail time and has now been released into the community. The parole board chair said that Haydon is now a low-risk offender and is a different man than he was 25 years ago. Even at one point, he was reluctant and anxious about being released due to the intense media scrutiny. His passive and loner nature is allegedly the cause of his initial involvement with Bunting and Wagner. Even though he is now free, he is under a strict monitor and has several conditions he must meet. He must wear an ankle monitoring bracelet, cannot speak to any media, and has a strict 6 AM to 9 PM curfew to ensure that he is complying with his parole conditions. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and if you have any notes for us or want to suggest a case for us, please leave it down in the comments below. Thanks.